Now to Brazil, where campaigning is officially underway in a race that will see the right-wing incumbent, Jair Bolsonaro, take on the left-wing former leader, Luiz Lula da Silva.
Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. All eyes are on Brazil as the first round of its upcoming presidential election on October 2nd has already stirred heated debate. Incumbent far-right President Jair Bolsonaro and left-wing former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, also known as Lula, could again become president. However, neither comes with a sterling political record. Meanwhile, the future of Brazil hangs in the balance. Graziella Moraes Silva, professor of Anthropology and Sociology here at the Geneva Graduate Institute and co-director of the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy, joins us from Rio de Janeiro to explore what the future of Brazil might look like. Professor Moraes Silva joined the Anthropology and Sociology department at the Institute in 2016. Between 2011 and 2016, she was at the Department of Sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and is still affiliated to the graduate program in Sociology and Anthropology and to the Interdisciplinary Network for the Study of Inequality at the same university. Her current research focuses on comparative race relations and elites' perceptions of poverty and equality. Graziella, thank you very much for joining us for this episode of What Matters Today. So first question is, what is at stake during this election, nationally and globally?
I think there is a lot on stake, both nationally and globally. I would start by highlighting what I see as three important issues due to the impact on both levels. The sustainability of democracy, the global governance of the environment, and the respect to human rights. I would say that Brazil, and I think a lot of people would agree, that it has been used as almost a textbook case of a third wave of democracy during the 90s. And recently, it also became an example of democracy backsliding. And I think in this election, if we can manage to respect electoral results, in particular the use of democratic technologies like electronic voting, we're sure we'll be able to recover from democratic institutional undermining. And the country has been experiencing that, not alone, but with a lot of other countries, both in the global north and in the global south. So if Brazil can do it, I think it's a great sign that other countries can also recover from this institutional undermining of democratic institutions. Brazil has also been an example in terms of environmental policies and has led a lot of deforestation, policies against deforestation, examples, especially in the mandate of Marina Silva, the first environmental ministry of the Lula administration. And at that moment in her mandate, Amazon deforestation was reduced to unseen levels, and innovative policies of environment governance were created in close partnerships with social movements and also became examples at the global sphere. Although the Lula Workers' Party's record in its second mandate, and especially during the Dilma administration, was debatable and there were a lot of crises, I think what we have seen with Bolsonaro's planned destruction of the Amazon and other Brazilian biomes like the Cerrado, it's really unseen in Brazilian history. And as most of you are aware, in recent years, we made headlines for the deforestation of the Amazon and fires in this very tropical biome. So, and also he has basically not officially withdrawn from environment agreements, but really questioned them. Beyond these particular policies, I think what is at stake right now is a distinction between a candidate who believes on the need of global governance of the environment and a candidate who has a nationalistic understanding of the environment and presents any type of global initiative as a type of imperialism against Brazilian nationality or nationalism. When I think about human rights, in contrast to democracy and environment, in that case, Brazil has never been an example. It's a country where indigenous people experienced a genocide that is not really officially acknowledged in history, and that police kills the Black population daily with little public outrage, and also has records of women and LGBT population experiences of domestic and public violence. But differently, I think, from previous governments that have tried to push forward a human rights agenda, the disregard for human rights is at the core of the Bolsonaro administration, partially because this has been his agenda through his entire political career. He has always rejected the need to discuss racism or gender equality, but partially because he has actually implemented policies to dismantle the little gains we had in the past few years, such as the institutional undermining of the Secretary of Racial Equality or the Secretary for Gender Equality. I would say that globally, Bolsonaro's reelection, I hope in Brazil it's only possible one re-election, means further weakening the human rights agenda in an important country of the global south. But locally, his re-election means accepting the continuous killing of racialized groups, women and the LGBT population, which have been on the rise since his first term.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. And what are some of the more important issues for Brazilians in this election?
I would say that in addition to the ones I mentioned, I would add economics, social policies, and corruption. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them. I think for the Brazilian elite, this election is a lot and has been always a lot about economics and this defense of continuous economic growth and the fear of what they see as anti-market measures. But for the poor, economics means basically access to work. And unemployment in Brazil has been above 10%, at least for the past 6 years, even if there was a slight decline in recent months. Because of the large percentage of the population in the informal market, the coronavirus pandemic has had a horrible impact and has brought a lot of people basically to have no wage whatsoever. And this has brought hunger back as a real problem in the country. In 2022, a national survey actually found that more than half of the Brazilian population experienced some type of food insecurity during this year, which is the highest percentage ever seen in the national census since the National Census Bureau started collecting this type of information. There was a moment that more than nearly 80% of the population had food security in Brazil in the early 2000s, for example. Of course, this is partially a result of the economic crisis, but it's also a result of the dismantling of social policies in Brazil, which is the most well-known case is the Bolsa Família, which is also like a program that received a lot of awards as a program that really had given access to income to very poor population. And the idea was that this program was actually exported to many different countries and actually allowed inclusion. There were criticisms to this program, of course, but it clearly allowed, for example, for people to have access to food and very basic needs. And it was interrupted by the Bolsonaro administration and recreated in the form of the Auxílio Brasil, which has been criticized for its design, but also for its clear electoral aims. It's a program that it's basically, it has increased the value of the stipend given to the families, but it's supposed to end in December, right after the elections. And finally, of course, there is corruption, which has been in the agenda since the last election and partially explained the consistent rejection of the workers, of Lula's Workers' Party, which has been accused of corruption, especially in the oil company. But it's interesting to think that there were a lot of corruption denounced against the Bolsonaro family, and that has not really impacted the election results. So it's almost like there is a different level of awareness, or as if blaming the Workers' Party, as if the Workers' Party was not allowed to be corrupt, but Bolsonaro somehow his corruption is allowed because that's not what is expected from him.
Can you give us an overview of the two candidates' platforms?
It's interesting. I'm actually currently in Brazil and walking around the streets in Rio. You have the feeling like you are experiencing the final of the soccer national championship. You see everywhere flags of the two candidates. You can actually sell them. It's very interesting to see the sellers having both flags on their stands. And you see all around. In the case of Bolsonaro, you see a lot of people having the Brazilian flag, which has been sort of embraced as the symbol of Bolsonaro. And there's a lot of debate if the left wing should also embrace that symbol. And in the case of the Workers' Party, you see a lot of the Workers' Party flag, which is a red flag with a star, but also LGBTQ rainbow flags and things like that. But it's really the mood of the city. It's less about platforms. And it's really this idea of polarization, right? You have to pick sides, and it doesn't really matter. And when you look at the public debates, there's not a lot of debates about actual platforms, but there are general ideas that drive what I would say the marketing strategies, but also sort of these underlying ideals that drive those campaigns. In the case of Bolsonaro, it's clear that there is this agenda of anti-corruption, which was the agenda that he was already elected last time. It's interesting to note that he always presented himself as new in politics, although he has been a congressman for many, many mandates. But he presents himself as someone who is out of the mainstream politics, and in that sense, out of corruption. And he insists a little bit on that. And with that agenda, he also brings a conservative agenda, meaning pro-family, anti-communist, and Christian. And this is really at the core of the Bolsonaro campaign, which partially explains his stronghold among the growing evangelical population in Brazil, which it now represents nearly 25% of the population. In the case of Lula, the focus is actually on recovering the consumption power of the poor, which has been basically his main achievement. A lot of people, and he has done that quite successfully in his first two mandates. But that was done in the context of commodities boom. So it's a bit unclear how this can be done in the current macroeconomic conditions. It will depend a much stronger focus, I would say, on redistribution through taxes and other types of minimum income policies, which are much less consensual agenda than sort of giving to the poor in an economic growth context. And we have heard little about how he's actually going to do that in this new macroeconomic conditions.
Thank you for that overview. And let's talk about Bolsonaro for a few minutes, because he's said some pretty interesting things in the past. And one example is that he referenced the 1964 coup that brought about 2 decades of military dictatorship in Brazil, almost with nostalgia. And there's a palpable fear that if he loses, rather than accepting defeat, he may stage a coup. So what does this mean for democracy in the second largest democracy in the Americas?
So as I mentioned earlier, I think this is one of the most important impacts of this election. I mean, if he's able to actually say that democracy doesn't matter, although he claims that he's democratic, but of course his definition of democracy is a democracy without institutions. It's really something that he believes he knows the best. He's really against minority rights and all that. But in order to push forward and to question the electoral results, he needs the support of other sectors of the country. And here, although the military has shown signs that it might support Bolsonaro, they cannot do it alone. Of course, there are very interesting research that shows how, because there is so much, it's not only the military, it's also the military police and their families and the firemen, and that actually creates a very big electoral basis for him. But also institutions that if they don't embrace democratic values, that can be a problem. But he also needs the support of businessmen. And there was a very recent leaked conversation in a WhatsApp group among sectors of the business elite, saying that they would be willing to support him as well. Nevertheless, a lot of people are claiming that this is actually a minority, and there was a public letter that was signed by more than 1 million people in Brazil, and a lot of demonstrations where this letter was read, and it seems to have a lot of support from the population. So I would say that I don't think that most of the population supports any type of democratic break, and I don't think they distrust the electoral technologies in Brazil so far as to support a coup based on these claims. Of course, if it's a very close election, that might be a problem. It's also important to put this in a global scale. I think that Bolsonaro is very isolated, of course, with the exception of the usual suspects, Putin and Orban and all those conservative countries. But especially in Latin American neighboring countries, there is a very little support for that type of discourse. Just yesterday, Boric, the Chilean president who Bolsonaro labels a terrorist, declared in an interview in the Times that Latin American presidents should act together against any threat of a coup in Brazil. Similarly, Petro, the recently elected Colombian president, has also declared and recently left a conservative alliance led by Bolsonaro. So I think both nationally and globally, that discourse that he has to bring back or to legitimize democratic break would not gain a lot of support. But maybe I'm being too optimistic here.
And so we have Lula on one side, we have Bolsonaro on the other. Would it be possible for a third candidate to break the ranks in this very polarized election?
So we just had our first television debate, and the polls that evaluated the debate, right, it was on Sunday night, and showed that Simone Tebet, a centralist, let's say, she's from the central MDB, one of the largest parties in Brazil, and Ciro Gomes from a center-left PDT party, had performed much better than Lula and Bolsonaro. So in that sense, there seems to be space for those candidates, and they are on the rise. So we don't have yet a poll showing if that debate had an impact. But still, they have currently, in the last poll that was released on Monday, less than 10% of vote intention. So, and the elections are in a bit more than a month. So I think it's very hard for them to be able to gain those votes. And as I said before, I think that there is this feeling of a polarization and this kind of soccer game type of view that people already picked sides. So I think it's very hard for someone to actually create a new soccer team now and have enough time to gain as many as supporters. But given the Brazilian electoral system is in 2 rounds, we are going to have the first round in the beginning of October and the second round in the end of October. The fact that those candidates might support one or the other might force Lula and Bolsonaro to actually come to the center. So those candidates actually might have a very important role in depolarizing and showing that, especially Lula, I would say, can come to the center and it's not only a Workers' Party type of mandate and that there are other agendas that can be included in those debates. So I think it will really depend on how they are going to behave after the first round.
Great. Thank you for that. That was actually my last question. So I just want to thank you so much, Graziella, for participating in this episode of What Matters Today.
Thank you, Dan.
That was Graziella Moraes Silva talking about the upcoming Brazilian presidential elections. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.